I'm here again with JMike. JMike, like I said, you've been doing a couple different things. You have a new project going on right now called Axioms On Trial. And so I thought you could maybe start by talking about that.
Yeah, so I originally hosted on the Atheist Roundtable, which you've come on, and we had Jenna Belk and Drag and some people who've hosted on the ACA as well. I've had a bunch of school stuff, so I haven't been able to give as much dedication to that as well. But the channel that we're doing now is called Axioms On Trial. I do that with a co-host of mine who's a philosophy major named Cease, or he goes by Cease to Know, who is just an absolutely brilliant person to work with. So it's fun for me because I'm just being able to learn alongside the the person that I'm working with. So what we basically do is we have anyone from TikTok apologists, which yes, they exist, believe it or not. Yeah, and don't shun the the idea that it's not worth doing, because there's videos that people do on there that get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of likes. So there's a lot of eyeballs there, and I would encourage anybody in the audience to do counter apologetics on there as well. But we'll talk to anybody from that to guys like that have PhDs in New Testament studies. So really anybody and everybody, we put ourselves out there for a conversation. And it's really just a lot of philosophy, theology, science, and the fun stuff.
Quick on the TikTok thing too, because I there's a lot of people that are older that watch the show that don't really get TikTok, and I barely get it myself, and I'm about to be 25 pretty soon. So it's like, yeah, it's kind of weird, it's kind of different, but people were saying, oh, you shouldn't waste time on this Facebook or Twitter thing, or even this YouTube thing either. And all of these things have blown up, and TikTok already has the numbers. There's already millions of people that are using TikTok. And on top of that, they already have content creators, up and coming, Christian apologists and spiritual gurus and all kinds of stuff that are making this content that's affecting not just people like us, but younger than us, like kids, lots of kids watching these TikToks, and how videos are found on there isn't the same as YouTube, where you either get recommended to it or you're searching for it. Like, they have continuous feeds where you can just come through stuff that are based on your interests. And so TikTok scares the hell out of me, because that, I think, is going to be a catalyst for a whole other just world of BS that people like us who like to talk about BS and like to talk about what we think is true, it isn't true, are going to have to deal with, because people are going to start with claims that they just heard on TikTok one time and just thought were true. So it's important what you're doing, I think, when you're talking about, stuff like that in particular, but also just all the other stuff you're doing on there as well. So tell us, what kind of conversations that you've been having? Because I know you've been talking to people from a different range of beliefs, shall we say.
Sure. Yeah. So I can't please everybody is what I've figured out. So if I'm either picking too much on Christian theology, or I'm picking too much on witch talk, which is a thing where kind of hang out, so to speak.
Yep.
And the spiritual kind of realm, I do a lot. So it can go from the Ron Wyatt type of claims of a Duru Pernar site, or all the way up to the idea motor effect with Ouija boards, or the pendulum, and trying to explain the oscillation between potential and kinetic energy, and just try to give some insight on hey, we've understood this since 1852. This has been, there have papers on the idea motor effect. My whole thing is that if you have some idea that you have in your that you think is true, and you're convinced that that's the case, it shouldn't have any problem investigating that, and so you shouldn't get upset by that, because anything I believe, I'm going to kind of say, bring it on. If you want to test it out, because I feel like that should always be scrutinized in some way, especially if it's true, because you're not going to have a problem coming out of the fight.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that's what this show is all about, right? Talking about what people believe and why. And the why part sometimes gets people up, because maybe they don't know why, or maybe they just haven't thought about it all the way through, or maybe they did have a why, but they found out that why wasn't as good. And yeah, it's important to kind of debunk that stuff, especially if what I see on TikTok in particular is you have people who do this fake stuff, whether it's CGI or something, whatever, stuff that something like you or me be able to point out, because we might have some experience with graphic design or something, but somebody who doesn't may not be able to point out. And then there's like the other kinds of stuff where people are giving some kind of advice, or they're talking about, they pretend like they're experts on some particular topic. It might be a health expert or a Bible expert or something, and they just give their quick 1 minute hot take, you know, and they make it sound very authoritative. It's like, we talked about Plandemic, you know, the reason why Plandemic, that documentary about how the COVID-19 virus is, you know, was a conspiracy, well, that spread really well because it looked like a Netflix produced documentary in terms of like production quality. Like, it wasn't just made out of some guy's basement.
Yep.
And so I think that's something you see with TikTok, because like, as long as you have good lighting, as long as you have a decent camera, maybe you get a couple cuts in there, you can make a TikTok video look really slick. And just that presentation alone is going to be convincing for some people about what's true and what isn't. And I really worry about that. I really do.
Yeah. And I've kind of put it this way too, where I've had people message me and say, your videos have helped, or they've steered me into different locations that have helped me, or whatever it might be. And the theme of that to me is like, you know, if you're convinced in any of that way towards what I say, like, still apply that skepticism. Like, don't just believe. And I think that's the difference between like what people who care about truth and people who don't, is that they're going to say, look, if I convinced you, like, please doubt what I'm saying, because that's the whole thing that I'm getting at, right? So it's not that this is excluded from what I'm saying. It's just that you need to apply this universally and honestly. I mean, that's the best thing to me. The best thing you can do is be intellectually honest. At least just make an attempt to be so. It shines through.
I think so. And like, you know, there's some beliefs that maybe I could convince you are true in a minute. There's a lot of beliefs that I should not be able to convince you are true in just a minute. And like, that's all you have on TikTok. And that's what some people try to do. Of course, you know, people do like multi-part TikToks and stuff like that. But the medium is the message, right? The medium is the metaphor. I mean, like, people are going to adapt to this, you know, technology, this new social media presence, and just make the most convincing, slick thing possible. And like, it seems to me, I don't know, I feel a sense of powerlessness when I look at that, because I can make my responses, but if I'm not looking as good as some of these other people, or if it gets buried amongst a whole other kinds of responses, people aren't looking at those responses, especially with TikTok. They're just looking at that video and then they scroll on to the next feed. They're not even looking at the comments most of the time. So
yeah,
what do you think is the best way of combating this? Because I know you're trying to make these responses, but do you think we'll have to adapt to different kinds of tactics in the future? Or, you know, what's your goal even when you're doing this?
So my goal is pretty simple. It's really just to promote but critical thinking. So it helps to kind of understand my background. My family is, well, my mom, my dad, like, they were like religious. My mom's Catholic, but I was given the most ultimate freedom in the regards of kind of going through that process, right? I was never forced to go to church. I was never forced to believe X, Y, and Z. It was, you know, things were presented to me by friends and family and things like that. But I always ultimately had this choice. And I don't want to come off like as a pat myself on the back, so to speak, but I see the methodology that I kind of been able to go through, and then the things that happen when you're younger that stay with you, that makes it really hard for you to kind of break out of these thoughts. And so my thing is, I know that's a process, and I know you need to kind of hear these things over and over again. And that can work negatively, because you can hear the same thing maybe 3 or 4 times. You go, oh, I've heard that 4 or 5 times. That must be true. That's not really what I'm trying to do. It's the fact that you take that and then you can test that, right? You can try to, my whole thing is akin to the scientific method. I mean, we should be able to verify this, test this. There should be some peer review involved. There should be something that distinguishes your imagination and makes it reflective of the reality we're experiencing. And so I always try to put it like, you're never going to have the answers there, or maybe the best method. But what I like to tell people is that everybody's trying to put a mirror in front of reality. And that mirror represents truth, right? And so, of course, when you lay down models and theories, you're going to have cracks, you're going to have blemishes, you're going to need to get Windex out and try to scrub the mirror, so to speak. But by the end of the methodology, you should at least not, like, the idea is to not be able to distinguish the mirror that's reflecting reality from reality itself. It should be as close as it possibly could. And so I think the more that people try to at least keep in their head that these things we say in science or these things that we claim are true are really just models of what we're experiencing, because we are kind of limited and blocked off from that, right? We're not going to just have that ability. And that's what I love, man. Discovery, like, we weren't born with all the answers, and we get the option to have discovery. Like, how cool is that? I think that's just one of the coolest things that we get to be a part of and pass that down to other generations. So
yeah, you're right. I mean, it does, you know, it can take some time. Like, not everybody's going to be convinced just by one TikTok that they see something, as much as I you know, catastrophize about that. Like, I wasn't convinced of the truth of Christianity just because one person told me one time. It was a culmination of my life experiences, me going to church and me having those activities and kind of, shall we say, simulating some of those spiritual experiences, I guess, you know, when it comes to those worship times and stuff like that. So, you know, that there's definitely going to be multiple ways to approach it. I can't help but think that, like, when it comes to stuff like TikTok, I guess the best way to do it is to just put that content out there and just make it as good as everybody else that's making stuff on there, and just compete for those ideas. Because unless TikTok starts cracking down and saying, like, oh, this is BS, or hey, content warning, some of the stuff in this may not be true, like Twitter and some other places are doing, you know, I think the fight is just going to have to be up to us content makers that post stuff on there, and people who watch this show, honestly. Like, that's gonna be it, because I mean, slick production values is just controlling everything these days.
100%. It's the shiny lights and buttons kind of, you know, can catch your eye, so to speak, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, I want to remind you guys, this is a live call-in show. We have some open lines right now. We're going to get to some of your calls, but we need some more calls first. We got to get your calls so we can talk to you guys, because that's what we do here every single week. So what are some of the conversations you've had on Axioms on Trial that, like, made you really think? Because, like, I know you've been doing this stuff for a while. Like, you know, you've been talking about this for a little bit before you were doing this channel. So, like, was there stuff that was harder for you to deconstruct more than others, or is it all just kind of like, oh, I've kind of done this before?
That's a great question. So I would say I got really tripped up in certain philosophical arguments where the lexicon of the jargon kind of in itself is confusing. So I relate that to, like, if you're going to learn about evolution or these things, like, you're going to find yourself going, well, what's a nucleotide, right? Yeah. What's adenine? What's cytosine, right? You're not even going to get through the full sentence because you're just kind of defining these words. And so I think it's not like when someone is presented the modal ontological argument or these other various kind of armchair theist arguments, it's not that I would think I was mistaken at one point. It was like, hey, maybe there's something here, until I see what's being used with language and how language is kind of being misused. So I wouldn't say that there's anything that's, at least on the theist side, that's pushed me. I think if anything, I've become more of a Gnostic atheist, especially towards, like, Christianity or Islam or anything like that. But I would say perhaps just the kind of understanding and feeling intimidated by the theist philosophers before you kind of get into that, you can kind of be put off by certain people that use certain things, or the necessity contingency type of arguments where we don't even know if in a level of causation or physics, if we're even going off the right sense of causation, or if we should even say, you know, the principle of sufficient reason is valid, or these types of things. So I think that's where it gets tough for me, right? Because we're doing a lot of a priori deduction and things that I don't see how we're actually showing it's the case. And so those have been challenging for me. It's kind of like, it's always going to fall down to, well, your epistemology doesn't accept that, right? And my epistemology does. And it's like, well, then now we got to kind of zoom out and look at each other's epistemology. And so,
you can't have logic without God, you know, those kinds of things, or the universe is a series of causes, and, you know, God has to be the first cause because blah, 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 you know, like versions of that. They wouldn't use the wording that I'm using, but, you know, you're right. It's how they dress it up. They make it sound very respectable and very intellectual. And I can see how some of that stuff can be convincing, until you read some of the skeptical arguments to that, especially like from people who actually have philosophy degrees, right, that have looked at this stuff, because some of this stuff really isn't as new, you know, it's just kind of been repurposed or remade for different audiences and stuff like that. So
Exactly.
yeah, but if you're not looking for kind of the skeptical responses, then you can just kind of leave it at that. But you know, I really do struggle to find people besides the every once in a while, you know, like Christians who actually use a lot of those really meticulous philosophical arguments, because 99% of the people, like the only time I've ever heard a lot of this philosophical stuff is when I'm doing like this show. I'm not hearing it in real life. I'm not hearing it from my Christian friends. I'm not hearing it from, you know, my life experiences never really told me this, besides the occasional apologists and stuff that I met when I was a Christian. But like, most people aren't using this to justify their beliefs anyway. And
well,
me,
most people aren't coming to the conclusion on those beliefs too, right? You know, and so, and I don't want to say it's ad hoc or post hoc necessarily, but it does seem kind of, I think you do need to look at it the light is that, I mean, did the modal ontological argument really convince you that a God exists?
Yeah.
Because I'm willing to bet it probably didn't. And that might be a fault on my end to assume that. But I've talked to a lot of people and I've never had someone go, hey, I started believing God because of the modal ontological argument. It more so seems to be these kind of post hoc rationalizations where you can manipulate and use language. And I think Matt Dillahunty said it the best. I think it was him who said, you know, language is our bitch. We can do whatever we want with it. And so, and I think that's very true with philosophy. And I see like someone like him recognizes that. And I think he's a great example because he knows the philosophy, but will talk in words in ways that the whole audience is going to understand. And I think that's the difference between the theist and the philosophy is you get lost in this kind of word salad that not everyone's going to understand, even if you are making a good point. So,
and, you know, I've read the Bible, JMike. I don't remember Jesus ever using the ontological argument. You? I don't remember that happening, or really any of these arguments.
I'm not convinced that that's the case either.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he did the miracles and stuff. That might have been more convincing, but we don't have that, so I don't know. It is what it is. But maybe, do you think you have a miracle, or maybe you have a good argument you can call into this show? This is Truth Wanted. We're live and we're ready to go, and I think we're ready to take some calls. If you are, JMike,
I'm always ready.
Cool. Well, before we do that, first we have to give a special shout out to our awesome patron of the week. Every single week, we pick somebody from our patrons to shout out and give a special thank you to. And this week, I want to give a special shout out to Neil, the 604 Atheist. Hey, I know that guy. He's pretty cool, I guess. Neil, the 604 Atheist, you're awesome. Thank you so much for donating. And if you would like to donate to this show, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The first one is going to be patreon.com/truthwanted. And those of you who are watching this show live, you may have noticed a little bit of a change. We're not doing super chats anymore. If you look at the top above your chat screen there, you can actually donate directly to the ACA. The reason why we're doing that is whenever you do a super chat, some of that money goes to YouTube, and instead none of that has to go to YouTube. So if you're not too big on YouTube and you don't want to give them your money, you don't have to. You can just do it straight for the ACA. So go ahead and click that donate now button at the top if you're interested in doing that. It helps pay for like this equipment and stuff and a bunch of other stuff that we have to upkeep here for the ACA. So thank you guys so much who donate. And now I think we can get to some calls.